Good morning. Great to see everyone on this beautiful day. As we begin, I want to welcome students and staff and faculty and visitors to the second of our Restoration Appreciation Lectures. Before I get into the introductions and things, a few minor notes I want to bring to your attention. Immediately following this session, we will continue it in the legacy with a question and answer time with both Dr. Charlie Starr and our speaker, Dr. James Gorman, which I'll talk about here in a second. And so what would be great is if you let those two go to the front of the line and get their meal so they can eat it, so they can talk, so they're not eating and talking with their mouths full, right? And so if you have questions, which we're hoping you do, don't ask them now or right after the thing, ask them in there. Is everyone on board with that? Okay, Ron is, the rest of you will figure it out, hopefully. So that's aside. If you are a guest with us, we also invite you to stick around for that question answer and the meal. For Restoration Appreciation guests, your meal is only $6. So we would love to have you stick around, get some food, and then head in there for the Q&A session. All right. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. James Gorman. That is, that is his professional name, but apparently most people call him Jamie. I'm sure he will answer to any of those things. Dr. Gorman is the professor of history at Johnson University down in Tennessee, just outside Knoxville. If I can make a quick plug for you students, we'll be going down there in April for the Stone Campbell Journal Conference. So if you want to block that out now, we would love to have you along for that trip. It's always a good time, and you can hear more about restoration-y scholarship things. In addition to various articles about history and the Restoration Movement, his books include Among the Early Evangelicals, The Transatlantic Origins of the Stone Campbell Movement, Slavery's Long Shadow, Race and Reconciliation in American Christianity, as well as contributing 3 chapters in the book Answered by Fire, The Cane Ridge Revival Reconsidered. His most recent publication is a fresh edition and reworking of Richard Hughes's book entitled Reviving the Ancient Faith, The Story of Churches of Christ in America. We were just talking, and he said that was 6 years in the making, so he's very pleased to have that done and hoping that you check it out as well. Dr. Gorman is viewed by many as the up-and-coming expert in the Restoration Movement, which makes it our honor to have him on campus today to present to us. I found that on his biography page at the Johnson University website. He says this: history is not about dates and facts. History is the complex story of who we have been. When studied well, history has the capacity to transform individuals. It is my hope and it is my prayer that Jamie's presentation this morning is not just informative, but also transformative. Join me in welcoming Dr. Jamie Gorman.
Thanks so much, Sam. Well, thank you, Sam, for that, and thanks to everyone here at the Great Lakes Christian College community. You all have been amazing. Phil picked me up and showed me around yesterday and was extremely hospitable. Thanks so much to John. Unfortunately, his back's all out apparently, so sorry, John, that really stinks. But he's been great, and Randy has been great, and got to catch up with President Weller today. We'll meet President Weller and learn things about the community. I feel like this is my first time here, but I have a deep sense, of connection already to GLCC. So, origin stories deeply shape our identity, theology, and practice. That is, the stories that we tell ourselves about where we came from and who we have been wield enormous influence today on how we perceive ourselves, what we believe, how we practice. So in other words, a key function of origin stories is identity formation. And for Christians, our origin stories deeply shape our identity, theology, and practice. But here's the deal. Many adherents of the Stone Campbell Restoration Movement have never heard the full origin story. For a long time, the basic narrative of the movement's origins went something like this. Here's the story. Around 1800, Thomas and Alexander Campbell, as well as Barton Stone, escaped the sectarian vision of the Presbyterian Church and started a non-denominational movement in the United States. That non-denominational movement sought to unite Christians by rejecting divisive things, and they believed that creeds, confessions, and denominations were those major causes of Christian division, and so they rejected them. Now, on the constructive side, they said that Christians could achieve unity by restoring the New Testament church. All Christians, they argued, could agree on the New Testament as the ultimate authority. These leaders and their colleagues were inspired by several disparate forces. These forces: democratic ideals focusing on individualism and sovereignty of the people, the rugged frontier context, Enlightenment ideals about Christian unity, illustrated especially with John Locke, and primitivism from diverse sources. And then some historians have added like a dose of exceptionalism. That is, the leaders of this movement were unique at that time in their defense or their desire for unity and in their emphasis on restoring the New Testament church as a means of unity. Okay? So, large parts of that origin story are true, so don't hear what I'm not saying today. I am not saying that we should throw out that story, but what I want to do is to put all those disparate parts in their religious and political context that gave them coherence and that gave them meaning. So what I'm going to do today is to offer a more capacious origin story that contextualizes the leaders of the movement, contextualizes their ideas and their practices within, this is the context, the transatlantic evangelical movement of the 1790s and the early 1800s. Okay, so that was a mouthful, so let me say that again. I want to propose a broader origin story that helps us understand who the early leaders of this movement were, which theological voices influenced them, what Christian practices inspired them. And what I have found in my research over the last 10 years or so is that Stone Campbell leaders were part of a broader movement that captivated English-speaking evangelicals across the transatlantic region. So, although I can't tell you that whole story today, I can tell you a part of it. And so, first, here's what I'm going to do today. First, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about a definition of evangelicalism, okay? So, after we have our definition of evangelicalism clarified, then I want to work through 4 areas central to both evangelicalism and early Stone Campbell leaders. Those 4 areas: first, unity efforts; second, the missionary society; third, revivalism; and then fourth, anti-slavery. In each of those sections, I will describe the evangelical practice or theology, and then I will explore Stone Campbell connections. So that's what's coming. And then finally, I'll wrap up by making some concluding remarks about how this evangelical origin story might shape our future life together. So, before I dive in, I should let you know the handout that you have before you. When I was talking to John, he told me not everybody has Stone Campbell history background, and so not all of you will understand Stone Campbell stuff. So because of the nature of what I want to say today, I'm like bouncing around a lot. I'm doing a topical thing instead of a chronological story. So I recognize I'm just going to appeal to a name, and you might not know who that name is. Or I'm going to appeal to a thing that's key in restoration history, and you might not know what that is. So what you have is a chronology of some key events that I'll appeal to throughout. So you might want to look at that to sort of orient yourself, if that's helpful. And also, I've given you like really short biographies of key people I'll talk about, but I'll just mention them as pieces of evidence along the way for my argument. And then on the other side of that is just my outline. So if you want to see kind of where I'm at, and if you want to write down questions on those sections, you can do that and bring those later to the Q&A. So let's jump in. Let's get a definition of evangelical. So evangelical has meant a lot of different things since its origin as a label in the Protestant Reformation. But it is a technical term that historians use to describe a particular group of Christians who emerged in the 18th century. That's the 1700s. Historians have come up with at least 3 ways to define evangelical. The 3 are: there's a historical, there's a theological, and there's a cultural, and I take them all. So let's go through those. In a historical sense, there are 4 major Protestant tributaries that fed into the river of evangelicalism in the 18th century. First and most influential was English Puritanism. That included Baptists, Independents, and English Presbyterians. I've got some of the places circled on this map, but not all of them. Second, Scottish Presbyterianism was a transatlantic evangelical force. As the Scottish diaspora, people moving out of Scotland from the early 17th century, created evangelical hubs in places like Ulster, that's Northern Ireland, where the Campbells lived, and also in Pennsylvania, where the Campbells moved in 1807. Third, Anglicanism provided the form of the voluntary religious societies, which I'll say more about later, that became the key structure for cooperation across denominational lines. Further, George Whitefield and John Wesley also emphasized holiness, revivalism, and new birth. We'll say more about that later. Fourth, finally, continental pietism contributed what became central characteristics of evangelicals. Those included a new birth, experiential theology, are you born again? Small gatherings for Bible reading and lay participation, we still use those today, social activism, and a commitment to missions. So, by the middle of the 18th century, the confluence of those four tributaries had created a distinctive transatlantic, that is across the Atlantic, evangelical community that grew to dominate the social life in some areas. And the revivals of the mid-18th century, we often call them the Great Awakening, these were the crucible of evangelical identity formation. So, this historical sense is then complemented by a theological description based on a pattern of convictions and attitudes, which include, according to the guy that wrote these up, David Bebbington, biblicism, which is a reliance on the Bible as the ultimate religious authority, conversionism, which is a stress on new birth, activism, which is an energetic, individualistic approach to religious duties and social involvement, and crucicentrism, which is a focus on Christ's redeeming work as the heart of essential Christianity. And some scholars, I would say rightly, want to add an emphasis on the work of the Holy Spirit. And so these theological commitments were at the heart of evangelicalism in the 18th and 19th century. And then finally, historians like Kristen Kobes-Dumay insist evangelicalism is best understood as a culture produced and consumed. You know what I mean? Like songs, books, magazines, gatherings, rituals, political norms, institutions, gender norms, racial identity, sentimentality, etc. So cultural evangelicalism easily breached denominational boundaries and wielded influence even on those who did not formally affiliate with its institutions. That is, you can be deeply influenced by these things without joining their club. In all three senses, historical, theological, and cultural evangelicalism deeply influenced the Stone Campbell movement's origins, identity, theology, and practices. Okay, so let's go to the second part of my lecture. Unity and cooperation. So here we go with these four areas where I've seen evangelicalism deeply influence Stone Campbell folks. Evangelicals sought Christian unity from the very beginning. They were ahead of us on the curve, all right? They cooperated across denominational lines for three things in particular: prayer, revivals, and missionary work. One of the foundations for evangelical cooperation was new birth conversion, are you born again, as the true marker of Christian identity. That is, a Christian's denomination mattered much less than their conversion experience. So for example, George Whitefield, a leading evangelical during the Great Awakening of the middle of the 18th century, he expressed this non-denominationalism in a popular sermon anecdote. He said this: "Hey, Father Abraham, whom have you in heaven? Any Episcopalians? No. Any Presbyterians? No. Have you any Independents or Seceders? No. How about Methodists? You have Methodists there? No, no, no. Well, whom have you there? We don't have those names here. All who are here are Christians, believers in Christ. Men who have overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of his testimony." "Oh, is this the case?" said Whitefield. "Then God help me, and God help us all, to forget party names." That's their name for denominations, a party. "Forget party names and become Christians in deed and in truth." This is 1740s. Whitefield's de-emphasis on denomination was common among evangelicals. In fact, one of the Great Awakening leaders, his name was Samuel Davies, who was president of the College of New Jersey until his untimely death in 1761. He argued that Jesus' followers were Christians more than they were members of any party or any denomination. And he made this case in a sermon titled, remember this sermon name, "The Sacred Import of the Christian Name." Davies held up the name Christian, first used at Antioch, which is in Acts 11:26, as, quote, "a Catholic name intended to bury all party denominations." And it's that idea, 50 years later, that became a prominent feature of Christians of the Stone Campbell movement in all parts of the United States. And I've circled the three major places where Christians emerged in the early national era. And Rice Haggard is the person of the Stone Campbell movement who presented the case first in 1794, and then eventually he published a pamphlet that used Davies's sermon, that evangelical sermon, as a blueprint. I mean, it's a literal blueprint, and scholar Max Ward Randall has shown the connections. Haggard called his book an address to the different religious societies on the sacred import of the Christian name. He wrote that denominational names have a, quote, tendency to disunite the body of Christ, to scatter its sacred members, and to cause them to bite, devour, and be consumed of one another. Christian, Haggard reasoned, was both a scriptural name, that is Acts 11:26, he pointed to that, and, quote, a Catholic name intended to bury all party denominations. He's literally just quoting Davies from earlier. Haggard convinced James O'Kelly that this was right and true in 1794, and he persuaded Barton Stone that it was true in 1804. So, when Stone Christians dissolved the Springfield Presbytery in 1804, it was because they believed their Presbyterianism contributed to division and, quote, party spirit among professing Christians. So instead of embracing a party, they resolved that their presbytery should die and be dissolved and sink into union with the body of Christ at large. For there is but one body and one spirit, they said. They would be Christians only. And there were missionary implications to all of this as well, since, this is quoting them again, quote, dying sinners are kept from the Lord by the existence of sects and parties in the church. Because of that, to reject parties and instead unite with Christians of other denominations was part of the glorious work that the Lord is carrying on in our Western country, they said, which we hope will terminate in the universal spread of the gospel and the unity of the church. And it wasn't just them. Elias Smith in New Hampshire, another of the early Christians, claimed that he also discovered this idea and preached a sermon in 1802 on using the name Christian based on Acts 11:26. So in some of this section, Stone Campbell leaders carried to completion the evangelical idea that Christians should reject partyism and instead use the name Christian. Now, the cooperative posture also emerged, right in this unity and cooperation section, in the concert of prayer movement, which Scottish evangelicals had started in the 1740s. The title of Jonathan Edwards' pamphlet, which you see pictured here, reveals the key goals of the prayer movement. Here's the title: An humble attempt to promote explicit agreement and visible union among God's people in extraordinary prayer for the revival of religion and for the advancement of Christ's kingdom on earth. And the title keeps going. They had a thing with long titles back then. For evangelicals, the movement for unity was tied directly to revivalism and to missions. In fact, the emphasis on unity and revivalism and missions were inextricably bound together for evangelicals in the 18th and in the 19th centuries. So in sum, on this first section, evangelicals argued that what mattered most was not one's denomination, but rather one's commitment to Jesus as taught in the Bible and on one's own new birth conversion. Evangelicals view the New Testament as an authority that was more ancient and more accurate than the denominational authorities that arose later, like confessions in history. They said this implicitly, and sometimes they said it explicitly. So based on the common ground of the New Testament and their conversion experience, evangelicals called for unity so that Christians could cooperate across denominational lines for two ministries in particular: missions and revivals. So that's our next two categories coming up. Evangelicals started the Protestant missionary movement in the early 18th century and propelled its takeoff. It really started in the 1790s, William Carey and others. Historian Ruth Rouse claimed, and this is a quote from her, "No outburst of missionary zeal, unless it be the Jesuit mission of the 16th century, has ever paralleled the missionary developments resulting from the evangelical awakening between 1790 and 1820. That's when the Stone Campbell movement started." That's an end quote. Christians from many denominations joined the evangelical missionary movement with great energy in the 1790s. So let's look real quick at how the Protestant missionary movement shaped the Stone Campbell movement. The key institution for the to get denominations to cooperate, right, for interdenominational cooperation in missions was the voluntary society. And I'm just going to go ahead and say, sorry, this is my drawing. I'm trying to depict what happened in the voluntary societies. It'll hopefully make sense as I explain it. Voluntary societies allowed individual Christians of different denominations, that's the ones in the orange over there, to pay annual member fees to a society that they wanted to support. Then the society, these are brand new, right? This is a great way to get around your denomination. They use this, the societies use those annual membership fees and other donations and funds to support the society's work, whether it's missions, Bible printing, education, and so on. Missionary societies became the most influential of these voluntary societies, and the London Missionary Society, I'm going to call that the LMS, which was founded in 1795, immediately became the leading interdenominational missionary society and really the leading society across the transatlantic. So for that reason, and because the LMS deeply inspired Thomas Campbell, it's worth taking a moment to explore its foundational meeting. So come with me to 1795 in London. Religious excitement was palpable among the thousands who gathered in September 1795 to experience the founding of this London Missionary Society. Religious leaders from various denominations participated in an act of unity that seemed unbelievable at that time. Baptists, Independents, Presbyterians, Methodists, and Anglicans co-founded an interdenominational society that for many present signaled a completely new era in Christian history. One of the leaders of the LMS, his name was David Bogue, he preached a sermon at one of the foundation meetings that captured this sentiment. And I've got his quote here on. He said, "We have now before us a pleasing spectacle. Christians of different denominations, although differing in points of church government, united in forming a society for propagating the gospel among the heathen. This is a new thing in the Christian church. Behold us here assembled." I can just hear him saying this, right? "Behold us here assembled with one accord to attend the funeral of bigotry. And may she be buried so deep that not a particle of her dust may ever be thrown upon the face of the earth." Thomas Hoase, who was also a leading minister and key constructor of the missions culture, he explained it in another founding sermon. He said, "The petty distinctions among us of names and forms, the diversities of administrations and modes of church order, we agree shall this day all be merged in the greater and nobler and characteristic name of, you know it, Christians. And our one ambition be to promote no partial, that is, denominational interests, since Christ is not divided, but with united efforts to make known abroad the glory of his person, where his adorable name hath never yet been heard." You see, right, the great work of converting the world to Jesus demanded that Christians rise above their denominational bickering and cooperate in the burial of denominational tribalism. Another leader of the movement named Rowland Hill summed it all up with a Wesleyan hymn that had become a mantra for these evangelical missionary advocates. Quote, "Let names and sects and parties fall, and Jesus Christ be all in all." So in my book, Among the Early Evangelicals, I argue that the transatlantic interdenominational missions culture that I just explained is the best context for understanding the origins of the Campbell movement. Thomas Campbell was a founding member of the Evangelical Society of Ulster in 1798, 3 years after the LMS. The meeting is in this, and the sermon are in this document pictured here. The ESU, the Evangelical Society of Ulster, was a sister missionary society to the LMS, to the London Society. And the LMS sent missionaries to Ireland for the ESU when Thomas was a part of it. And many of the leading architects of the interdenominational missionary movement were connected to the LMS and to the ESU. And I'm telling you what, the ESU was aggressively interdenominational, calling on Christians from different denominations to unite together based on ancient primitive authority in the New Testament so that they could all partner to send itinerant preachers to Ireland and perhaps beyond to convert people to evangelical Christianity. But Thomas Campbell's Presbyterian Church took issue with the ESU's anti-sectarianism and anti-denominationalism. And then so Campbell had to defend the ESU to his denominational leaders in 1799, and long story short, he did not win them over. Alexander Campbell, I talk about him also in the book, he experienced formation by the leaders of the missionary movement both in Ireland and in Scotland. For example, Greville Ewing and the Haldane brothers were among the most important leaders of the evangelical missionary movement in Scotland in the 1790s. And these Scottish leaders were also connected to the LMS and ESU. And it's okay if you don't know Ewing and the Haldanes. I will tell you that historians have long noted the influence of Ewing and the Haldanes on Alexander. But we have only been highlighting the primitivism of the Scottish influences. So in the book, I argue that their primitivism made no sense outside of their desire to unite with other Christians to convert the world to Jesus through missionary efforts. That's where their primitivism was birthed. That is, their primitivism, the idea that the New Testament could be a primitive authority that was higher than later denominational authorities like confessions, that primitivism emerged among evangelicals in order to justify cooperation with people from other denominations to complete the most urgent work before them, they believed, which was to convert the world to Jesus. Therefore, it should not be a surprise to you that when Thomas Campbell separated from his Presbyterian church in the United States in 1809 for being too tolerant in his Christianity, he and others founded a society using the ESU's constitution and its plan and its ideals. It's literally a facsimile, what he created. Thomas called the new organization the Christian Association of Washington, the CAW. Thomas said that the group organized the CAW, quote, for the sole purpose of promoting simple evangelical Christianity, free from all mixture of human opinions and inventions of men. The CAW would use membership fees from people of various denominations, yes, it was a voluntary society, to support itinerant preachers who would advocate for a, quote, pure evangelical reformation by the simple preaching of the everlasting gospel. The plan argued that it was the duty of the CAW to cooperate with other evangelical societies, and there were many of those societies in the United States by 1809. Like the evangelicals he had associated with in Ireland, Campbell expressed a vehement opposition to religious division, urging Christians instead toward unity. Campbell laid it bare, saying that he was, quote, tired and sick of bitter jarrings and janglings of a party spirit. He said that the rancor of party contentions had destroyed the primitive unity of the church. Not only was unity the original intention of Christ for his church, but Campbell believed the evangelical efforts to cooperate in a worldwide missionary errand would cause the church to, quote, be exalted to the enjoyment of her promised prosperity, that the Jews may be speedily converted and the fullness of the Gentiles brought in. Indeed, Campbell actually quoted at the end of his address, John 17, urging Christians to unite, because he actually believed Jesus' prayer was true, that Christian unity would be a testimony to the world, that Jesus loved them and would therefore lead to the world's conversion to Christianity. Now look, the Campbell movement would develop over the next decades, okay? But it is impossible to understand the origins of the Campbell movement outside of the transatlantic, interdenominational, evangelical missions culture. The Campbells experienced this culture in Ireland and in Scotland, and when they broke from the Presbyterian Church in the United States, they used the ideas and the practices of the evangelical missionary movement to start their reform in 1809. Okay, so let's jump into revivalism, the next section where I see evangelicals influencing the Stone Campbell movement. So as I argued earlier, evangelicalism's call to interdenominational cooperation was inextricably tied both to the missionary movement, which we just talked about, and to revivalism. So the leaders of the Christians made this clear in their last will and testament of the Springfield Presbytery, published in 1804, which I quoted actually earlier. They were saying that rejecting parties and embracing unity were part of the driving force of the revivalism that they believed foreshadowed a universal spread of the gospel. Some historians have even argued that the revivals in the 1790s to the 1820s that we call the Second Great Awakening were the catalyst of the missionary explosion. So, long story short, it is difficult to take any one of these major themes on their own, as they are all part of a broader evangelical culture that permeated the English-speaking transatlantic. Nonetheless, you know I'm going to try. Let's isolate revivalism for just a minute, okay? Historians of Christianity have long identified revivals as a key religious ritual that evangelicals institutionalized in the 1730s Great Awakening. And those revivals did not stop in the United States, even during the Revolutionary War. But in the early national era, beginning in the 1780s, evangelicals began praying that God would again pour out his Spirit like he did back in the 1730s and 1740s Great Awakening. So Barton Stone emerged as a key leader of the Great Revival in the West in 1801 in the place where I have the circle. But here's the deal. No one would have guessed this for his future when he first attended the Log College in North Carolina 10 years earlier in 1790. No one would have guessed it. He had grown up nominally Anglican before attending David Caldwell's Log College to earn a law degree. And at that time, he tells us that he was determined to ignore the revivals that were taking place among fellow students in the area that I have circled here. And those revivals were taking place under the preaching of a revivalist named James McGreedy. But his fellow students were persuasive, and eventually he attended one of McGreedy's meetings, and he recalled the experience like this. He said McGreedy's concluding remarks were addressed to the sinner to flee the wrath to come without delay. Never before had I comparatively felt the force of truth. Such was my excitement, he says, that had I been standing, I should probably have sunk to the floor under the impression. Under the preaching of other revivalists, then, Stone eventually experienced new birth conversion in 1791, and several years later he was ordained and called to minister to 2 congregations in Kentucky. Stone's conversion to evangelical Christianity happened right before the Second Great Awakening broke out. And he had learned all the tools of revivalism that would make him one of its leaders in the early 1800s. So Stone's teacher, there's so many connections here with the evangelical institutions at the time. Stone's teacher, David Caldwell, was one of the Presbyterian revivalists who, after they received their education at the College of New Jersey, the major revivalist school, now it's called Princeton, passed on the revivalist toolbox to students all over the frontier through these little log colleges. And that toolbox, which perpetuated evangelical revivalism, and it really started the Second Great Awakening, included in that toolbox was this really important tool called the sacramental occasion. A sacramental occasion was a multi-day celebration of the Lord's Supper. It included a fast day, usually on Wednesday or Thursday. There were preparation sermons on Friday and Saturday. There were communion sermons on Sunday. People got pretty amped, right, to take some communion after a long winter. And then Thanksgiving sermons on Sunday night and maybe on Monday as well. And let me tell you what, sacramental occasions became the sites for camp meetings and some rowdy revivals. So James McGreedy nurtured those sacramental occasions into a full-blown revival in Kentucky in the South. You see circled here is where his churches were. And Stone visited McGreedy's revivals in early 1801 to figure out what was up. Stone observed what he called religious exercises, and he became convinced that the exercises were a legitimate manifestation of God's overflowing Spirit in a time of revival. When Stone returned to his congregations further north, in the area that's circled coming up in Kentucky, they immediately began experiencing the same exercises which Stone described in his autobiography, and they included falling, the jerks, dancing, barking. Well, he says the barking wasn't really one, it's just a noise that you made if you had the jerks, running, and singing. The awakening spread, Stone said, quote, like fire and dry stubble driven by a strong wind. And so Stone planned his own sacramental occasion at his Cane Ridge congregation in 1801. And it became such an enormous revival that some historians call it America's Pentecost. The meeting continued for a week. Between 10,000 and 30,000 people attended, including Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterian. Stone said, quote, many things transpired there which were so much like miracles that if they were not, they had the exact same effect as miracles on infidels and unbelievers, end quote. Stone said that he prayed for revival and God, quote, answered by fire. The Spirit had descended on the people to wake them from their religious slumber. And for the rest of his life, and he was a rationalist in a lot of ways, but for the rest of his life, he believed that those exercises were an extraordinary work of God at a unique moment in history. And of course, Stone wasn't alone. Many evangelicals believed the same thing. What evangelicals could not agree on was free will. And Stone's view of free will, along with his willingness to reject confessions as the ultimate religious authority, led him to break from the Presbyterian Church. But we should not view this as a break from evangelicalism, not yet, because when the Christian churches published their defense for leaving the Presbyterian Church, and they published it in 1804, Stone maintained a typical evangelical view of new birth. He simply made it Arminian rather than Calvinist. As he argued in his compendious view of the gospel in 1804, he said the Bible's testimony is sufficient evidence for a person to either believe or to not believe. And when a person believes in the gospel, then God gives them the new birth conversion. That's what he believed in 1804. Condemnation comes only to those who do not believe, choose not to believe. Now, he did not like the label Arminian, but I'm telling you, Stone was an evangelical Arminian at this point in his life. He wasn't the only one either. Elias Smith up in New England, in the area circled on this map, also embraced evangelical revivalism and new birth conversion, one of the major leaders of the Christian movement. Throughout his autobiography, Smith described many revivals of religion at which scores of people converted. He even recounted times when revival preachers that he associated with and approved, they preached sermons against unconverted ministers. And some of that stuff sounded like Gilbert Tennant's well-known Great Awakening sermon, The Danger of an Unconverted Ministry, back in 1740. In 1805, Stone began publishing a religious periodical titled The Christian's Magazine. Well, it's actually got a really long name too, but that's the beginning of it. And he planned to concentrate on revivals of religion, tell the stories, and on conversion stories. The very first article in that magazine was a reprint account of a revival from the 1740s Great Awakening where he lived, Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And then the next article was his own account of the revival that he helped lead in 1803. He called it A Glorious Work of God. Smith wrote that the converted received baptism, which he, quote, administered according to the New Testament, and he preached the name Christians, leaving all unscriptural names behind. His magazine told stories about conversions in Africa, conversions of black people, conversions of the Jews. And when he began a new periodical in 1808 titled Herald of Gospel Liberty, he praised the revivals in Kentucky and reprinted the Christians' last will and testament. So in other words, long story short, Christians in the West and in the Northeast embraced evangelical revivalism. It was the central context for their beginnings and for their religious identity. Okay, that's revivals. We're on my last topic, anti-slavery. So finally, anti-slavery among evangelicals was part of a contextual package, right? This is repeat, in which unity, missions, and revivalism were all interrelated. Now, although evangelicals were always divided on the issue of slavery, some of them led the abolitionist movement in the 1780s and 1790s. To be sure, classical liberalism, with its assertion that all individuals had inalienable rights, did drive many people to the conclusion that slavery was immoral because it robbed people of natural rights. But evangelicals added religious reasons to the pile for rejecting slavery. For example, John Wesley argued in a pamphlet, Thoughts Upon Slavery, published in 1774, that slavery could not be reconciled with justice, mercy, or Christianity. He said that God would atone for the blood of slaves with the blood of traders and of owners. Other evangelical leaders from the Methodists, Baptists, Congregationalists, and Presbyterians joined the fight against slavery at the end of the 19th century, calling it anti-Christian and calling it a massive obstacle to the conversion of the world. Again, some Stone Campbell leaders joined evangelicals in the abolitionist movement. When James O. Kelly was still with the Methodists, he published a book in 1789 titled An Essay, let's see, I've got that. Essay on Negro Slavery. And Negro was the politically correct term at the time. After commending Wesley's pamphlet against slavery, O'Kelly condemned slavery for numerous reasons. First, he highlighted the horrible treatment of enslaved people, from the repugnant conditions of slave ships to the breaking up of families. Second, he argued that slavery was satanic. He said the whole system was a trick that Satan had played on Christians. Slave overseers were devils incarnate. Strong language for a man in Virginia. In 1789, third, O'Kelly said slavery destroyed missions efforts as Africans ran from Christians when they showed up on the continent because they were terrified of being enslaved. And finally, he said slavery violated natural rights. And for all these reasons, he believed that God would judge the United States, just a new Pharaoh, for its iniquity. And because he said all this in writing, some of his fellow Virginians despised him and threatened to kill him. More than once, had a knife drawn on him for this. And like O'Kelly in Virginia, Christians in the West also opposed slavery. They joined fellow Presbyterians who had published their abolitionist case as early as 1792. Stone said that that was an experience in South Carolina in 1797 that was the, quote, exciting cause of my abandonment of slavery. He said, my soul sickened at the sight of slavery in more horrid forms than I'd ever seen it before. Poor Negroes, some chained to their work, some wearing iron collars, all half naked, and followed and driven by the merciless lash of a gentleman overseer. Distress appeared scowling in every face. And a few years later, after that experience, Stone freed Ned and Lucy, two enslaved people that he had inherited from his mother at her death. Stone later recalled, quote, I had emancipated my slaves from a sense of right, choosing poverty with a good conscience in preference to all the treasures of the world. So for Stone, the abolition of slavery was one part of the larger work that God was doing in the evangelical revivals. It wasn't just its own thing. Stone declared, this revival has cut the bonds of many poor slaves. And other members of Stone's Cane Ridge congregation joined the fight. An elder at Cane Ridge, David Purviance, was elected to the Kentucky legislature as an anti-slavery representative in the state in the 1790s. And in 800, get this, Stone presented a resolution to the West Lexington Presbytery saying that slavery was a moral evil and those who continued the practice should be kicked out of the church. And the Cane Ridge congregation led the charge to make emancipation in Bourbon County, Kentucky, increase during the great revivals in the West. Some revivalists believe that the goal of Christian unity in the revivals and the renunciation of slavery were signs of the imminent millennium when Christ would come back. Historian Paul Conkin wrote that, quote, anti-slavery sentiment became almost synonymous with the revival. One of the things that we learn here is that, if we want to understand Stone and these evangelicals, we must take the missionary movement and revivalism and unity efforts and abolitionism and millennialism all together as part of the same religious culture that animated these people. For evangelicals like Stone, the revivals were a sign of the last days that made urgent the abolition of slavery and the conversion of the world. So in conclusion, the origin of the Stone Campbell movement is complex to be sure. Although leaders were influenced by diverse sources of thought and practice, I've tried to show that they were all influenced by an evangelical culture that emphasized unity and cooperation for revivalism and missions. Stone Campbell leaders did eventually build a new movement in the decades following the stories that I have told, right? But their beginnings were among like-minded evangelicals. The Campbells used the ideas and practices of the evangelical missionary movement to launch their reform in 1809. And the Christians embraced revivalism and free will theology that led them to reject parts of their Calvinist heritage, even as they borrowed and took to an extreme evangelical ideas about Christian being a better name than denominational names. The end product of all this, the end product of the evangelical inclination to bring together unity, revivalism, and missions, the end product was a post-millennial hope in the conversion of all people. God had broken into the world, they believed. Christians cooperated, sinners converted, missionaries preached, and God broke the chains of slavery. The stories we tell ourselves about who we were and who we have been deeply shape our identity, theology, and practices. And for this reason, and because my commitment to the discipline of history demands it, I'm very interested in telling full and accurate stories. I don't find a story of exceptionalism in the origins of the movement. Indeed, I have argued the opposite. The early leaders looked a lot like the evangelicals around them. But that makes the stories no less important for understanding who we've been, who we are, and who we want to become. So can I give you 3 takeaways? Let me give you 3 takeaways. Different Stone Campbell groups today will no doubt take different lessons from this origin story. The stories here might encourage some folks to reject an exclusivism that inhibits love and cooperation with Christians of different denominations. Ironically, yeah, Randy, would you get that? Yeah, that's good. Ironically, several types of exclusivism among Stone Campbell adherents today reflect what the early leaders denounced, a party spirit that fosters the idea that we are the only ones. Certainly, such exclusivism is out of step with the origins of the movement. For others, these stories may be a challenge to be more open to the work of the Holy Spirit. In the decades after the origin story I have told, Alexander Campbell's rationalism came to dominate most of the movement. But the Christians provide another story about who we were and who we might become. Is there room for the third person of the Trinity in the Stone Campbell churches today? Barton Stone and Elias Smith thought there should be. And still others will find in this origin story a willingness to speak truth about injustices in our own time, even when it's costly. Many of the early leaders believed that condemnation of slavery and working for justice in the world was an essential part of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Working for justice was not a hobby or something unrelated to the gospel. They said that the very work of God in the revivals, they believed this, was bringing about shalom in the world, restoring right relationships not only between people and God through new birth conversion, but between people and people by breaking the chains of injustice. So we've been thinking about who we have been, and I think the question for us as we reflect on our origin story is, who will we become? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was fantastic. And the lecture now turns into a conversation. So I invite you to join us in the legacy immediately after this to ask some questions, maybe get some clarification, not just of this presentation, but also of Dr. Starr's presentation earlier about C.S. Lewis. So we definitely invite you to do that. Grab your lunch and go on in there. As a reminder, they're going to go first. In that, while you let them go first, you could, I don't know, set up some tables and chairs to get that ready for the next class. That'd be fantastic. Let me pray, and we'll be dismissed. God, we thank you for history. As we look at it, we can see what you've been doing through it all. God, you're working in this world and have been working since the beginning. So God, thank you for this presentation to remind us of where we have come from and where we're going. May we embrace the ideals of unity and evangelism, of revival, and of social justice. May we take those seriously. And as we're formed here and as we move from this place, may we be reminded that we want to see your kingdom come now and in the future in a mighty way. Through Christ we pray all these things. Amen. You're dismissed.